In all that vast area south of the Sahara, before outsiders arrived, no one had discovered the wheel.
Really? No. Really.
So they did have wheels there that they used for transportation. They used wagons and cart.
Or invented even the simplest mechanical device. No one domesticated an animal or built a two-story house.
In an age where the masses are fed an endless stream of mental retardant.
It's like, okay, but when we got there, they had no development. When we got to Africa, they had no technological development. There's a reason that European civilization created this enormous gap.
I can already tell. This is going to be a fun one.
It was unfair or something like that. I think it's because Europeans are smarter.
In 1668, the acclaimed Dutch physician turned scholar and writer, Olfert Dapper, drew this little-known scene. It is the procession of the Congo king and his entourage. Of note, a keen observer will notice a gargantuan wheeled chariot. Correction, it's a palace on wheels. Atop the platform of the vehicle, one can see a man with an umbrella, domestic animals, flags, and other paraphernalia. But aside from the obvious fact that this shows Africans using the wheel well into the Middle Ages, it is the means of propulsion of this vehicle that is of highest interest to Kamjiverse and without history. Pulling the royal chariot is an army of men, and to understand why this picture explains everything about medieval Africa and its use of technology, while at the same time refuting the arguments of inferiority of the black man. Well, for that we need to go back. Back in time and back to the beginning of this argument itself. A popular trope against the black man is that black people, black cultures, and black nations never invented the wheel. The story of the wheel in Africa is not one of absence, but of a complex, deep-rooted history of knowledge, adaptation, and rational choice.
Creativity. But we know from historical and archaeological evidence that that's not true because they had other technologies. They had textile production, they worked with iron. When Europeans arrived in Africa, the African rulers were quite eager to acquire their firearms and even produce firearms locally. So we can rule that out right now. I mean, they were perfectly fine creating and adopting technologies.
It is a journey that begins with ingenious proto-wheel mechanisms in antiquity, flourishes in the Sahara and the Nile Valley, and experiences a purposeful renaissance in the kingdoms of Central and West Africa. Oh, by the way, Africans were using spindles to make clothes all the way back in 4650 BCE, and that's the oldest we can find in the Naqada period of Egypt and Nubia. And as you already know, multiple studies have proved that early ancient Egypt was a pure black African civilization. Also, in his 1820 account of Timbuktu, James Gray Jackson relates to us the irrigation water wheels, Shada Foss water wheel, at Timbuktu, and the potter's wheel among the Hausa. Remember, learned Western historians know of all these accounts, but they also know that African signs of civilization were systematically sought and destroyed by Europeans, intentionally. According to scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop and Théophile Obenga, African cosmogony, from the dawn of West Africa to the War of Central Africa, describe creation emanating from a spiraling mass, reflecting a cyclical understanding of time. This philosophy is not confined to oral traditions, but is materialized in symbolic art. The Bamileke people, encoded in the patterns of their Indop fabrics, while the Bakongo depicted in their cosmogram, a sacred circle representing the cosmos. Therefore, the principle of the wheel, symbolizing cyclic motion and cosmic order, was a fundamental concept known to African civilizations since antiquity. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we tackle the abstract notions of the wheel in Africa, let's review what archaeology actually shows. Long before the wheel was used for transport, the fundamental principle of rotational motion was mastered in Africa through the invention of the spiked wheel trap. This device, a spoked circular mechanism, often baited and designed to snap shut on prey, demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of mechanics. Its overwhelming concentration is found in Infra-Africa, with attestations from ancient Kemet and widespread use among diverse ethnic groups across the continent. The distribution pattern points unequivocally to an African origin. The significance of the spiked wheel trap cannot be overstated. It represents a prototypical application of the wheel principle. A tomb fresco from Hiampololis in predynastic Kemet, Nakarta II period, circa 3500 BCE, depicts this spoked mechanism, placing the concept of the rotating wheel firmly on African soil millennia before the chariot complexes of Central Asia. Let me repeat that. The concept of the rotating wheel firmly on African soil millennia before the chariot complexes of Central Asia. This African innovation serves as a conceptual and technological precursor, demonstrating that the intellectual leap to the wheel was achieved independently within the continent. So, not only did the African have the concept of the wheel, but they had it before everyone else. But there is even more evidence that Africans had and used the wheel. The ancient Sahara, during its more humid past, was a cradle of innovation and cultural exchange. During the Bavidian period, from 6000 to 2500 BCE, a time of pastoral societies, the wheel made its appearance in a transport role. The most compelling evidence comes from the Garamantes, a powerful Saharo-Sahelian people identified in West and Central African oral narratives as the Nara. They were master engineers, constructing vast underground irrigation systems, fogaras, and establishing complex trade networks. The Garamantes are credited with introducing the chariot to the Sahara. Approximately 500 depictions of chariots are etched into rock art across the desert, from Libya to Niger, Mali, and Mauritania. These images, showing both realistic two-wheeled chariots in a flying gallop and more schematic, abstract forms, were once thought to map trans-Saharan chariot routes. The rock art itself, sometimes showing chariots from an aerial, plan view, indicates their power as symbols of status, prestige, and cultural connection within a vast interregional network. But there is more. There is one artifact that has captivated the minds of all truth seekers, and it provides further evidence of the Black Africans' discovery and usage of the wheel. In ancient KMT, the wheel was not an unknown invention later adopted, but a technology whose application reflected a conscious and context-dependent choice. The evidence, as compiled by scholars like Heidi Kopp-Junk, reveals a clear but selective adoption pattern. The principle of the wheel was understood as early as the Old Kingdom. Discovered in the First Dynasty tomb of the official Sabu at Saqqara, the Sabu disc is a meticulously crafted sealstone artifact whose precise function remains an enigma. Shaped like a shallow bowl with a central socket, its most striking feature is a design of three intricately curved lows, or wings, that fold inward from the rim. This sophisticated, tri-lobed form gives the object a striking resemblance to a modern steering wheel. Despite this wheel-like appearance, it is classified as a stone vessel, and its purpose is unknown by Western scholars. Let me be clear here. If this artifact had been found in Europe, it would have been the subject of endless study and attention. So, if the wheel wasn't the preferred primary mode of transportation in all regions, why then bring up the incessant argument around the invention of the wheel? Well, the first postulate is that Africans did not invent the wheel because they couldn't, because they lack innovation. Even though we have already shown that Africa did invent the wheel before every other culture for multiple purposes, let us nonetheless address the argument that Africans did not have the capacity to invent the wheel. If indeed Africans do not possess the capacity to innovate, this trait will manifest itself through history and contemporary context, meaning I should not be able to find examples where Black people have produced inventions. Well, from the invention of writing, mathematics, medicine, religion, all the way to the invention of the autonomous robot that is drilling in Mars, we find Black people. And I will pass on the multitude of inventions, such as the cell phone, GPS, and the Internet, who have at their base Black people. And this phenomenon is not localized. We can find it with the people of Benin, who invented iron, and steel smelting, well ahead of any civilization in the world.
Another guess that someone might make would be that, well, people of sub-Saharan Africa were cut off from the rest of the world and therefore did not have the opportunity to borrow technologies from Europe and Asia. But we also know that that's not true because large parts of Africa were, in fact, connected with the rest of the world through trade networks. In West Africa, they were connected to the Mediterranean through the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. And in East Africa and parts of Southern Africa, they were tied into the Indian Ocean Trade Network. And in fact, some African merchants did visit India and Southeast Asia in the Middle Ages and would have had the...
So then, you must be thinking, if Africans were clearly capable of inventing the wheel, if Africans clearly invented the wheel, if Africans clearly used the wheel in multiple purposes, why are we being told that they didn't invent the wheel? I am glad you asked. That is because this has nothing to do with the wheel, nothing to do with Africans' ability to innovate, but everything to do with the intent of those who are spreading this simulacra. In fact, instead of asking why Africa didn't adopt the wheel, here is a better question. Why didn't Europe adopt the camel?
Camels would look at us.
And so, in light of that, we might also ask another question, which is, why didn't Europe adopt the camel? And that's basically a similar question to asking why Africans did not use the wheel. There was a demonstrably superior technology that the people of Europe failed to use. Now, was it because Europeans lacked innovation? Was it because they lacked the creativity to realize the potentials of using camel transport? Or were they so mired in cultural conservatism that they could not transition to a better technology even when it was staring them in the face? Because after all, they were aware of camel technology, they were aware of camel caravans, but they didn't adopt it. I would suggest that it wasn't a problem of lack of innovation. Now, hear me out. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Europeans are human beings. And like all other human beings on the planet, they have innovation, they have creativity, they have the ability to adopt new technologies when those technologies present themselves and when they are useful to them. After all, that's what every other population in the world does. So there's no reason to assume that Europeans would be any different. Okay, but if we take those assumptions as given, and if we assume that Europeans had innovation, how do we account for the fact that they did not adopt the camel, since we know the camel was a superior technology? At this point, you might be thinking, well, dummy, obviously, it's because of environment. You know, camels are not well suited to the European environment. To which I say, yeah, exactly.
The ridiculousness of the arguments used against the African becomes painfully obvious, even Orwellian, when it is suddenly turned against the accuser. All of a sudden, explanations that had been given by African populations and by Africanist researchers take on a dimension of rationality that was never afforded to the former. Here is the real reason why Africans didn't widely adopt the wheel. Or more precisely, here is the real reason Africans elected not to use the wheel in the majority of its potential transportation options.
You know, in order to operate wagons, you have to have animals to pull the wagons. And in the case of much of sub-Saharan Africa, it's not possible to have those animals, or at least it wasn't historically, because of trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness, which is a disease that is fatal to livestock. And it's spread by an insect called the tsetse, or the tsetse fly. So anywhere where the tsetse fly lives, those are areas that historically they could not keep livestock, and therefore they would have no use for wheeled vehicles, because they would have no animals to pull them.
This deadly disease is one of the most widespread in Africa, especially in the equatorial areas. So effective have been its inroads that large areas where colonization was attempted had to be abandoned by both settlers and the natives. Sleeping sickness not only attacks man, but it attacks and kills his domestic livestock as well.
Despite that, and contrary to the notion of universal ignorance, the technology of wheeled transport was quite widely known in pre-colonial West Africa. However, its application was intentionally limited and shaped by specific economic and environmental ration. The evidence reveals three primary uses. The primary application was for status, not transport. Elites in kingdoms such as the Home, Asante, Lagos, Calabar, Congo, and Boro fabricated their own African vehicles. These were paraded in processions, often drawn by people rather than animals, to display royal power and magnificence. There was some experimentation with wheeled gun carriages for cannons in states like Boro, Zinda, Diomi, Lagos, and Abeokuta. African artisans, particularly in the Home and Boro, demonstrated a clear understanding of the technology by not only repairing imported vehicles, but also building their own coaches and gun carriages from scratch, proving the knowledge was locally available. So what started as an argument against the innovation capability and the innate intelligence of the black man essentially turned out to be one of the best proofs of the African's acute adaptation in innovation. If the very advanced Europeans of the 19th century were bound to abandon the very element that would cause them to use the wheel, the big gain, so then how can Europeans turn around and use that argument against the African? How can they say that Africans have no intelligence for not using the wheel when they had to abandon their own wheeled transport when they were faced with the same environmental constraints as the Africans? This is very reminiscent of the argument from Jared Diamond in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel, where he shows that the differences in economic outcome around the world are not due to innate differences in intelligence, but very much so due to environmental factors that determine acquisition, selection, and retention of technology. In other words, your environment is more deterministic of your economic outcome, and I will add to that geography as he did, more so than the opposite intelligence of a group. And this is in fact spectacularly illustrated by the 7th to 13th century Europe, where common Europeans, a backward peasant of sort, was poor, sickly, and illiterate, until such time that the African, who are the time again because of environment and geography, possess knowledge that was well beyond the European wildest conception. Are we then to conclude, if history has stopped at the 9th century, that the European is incapable of innovation? Should we then conclude that the middle of the Dark Ages were in fact proof that the European is unqualified for civilization? Should we then start writing endless books, justifying the inferiority of the Europeans in their inability to take themselves out of the downward spiral of the Middle Ages? Of course not. It would be as ridiculous as trying to erase the ancient Egyptian history with black people in the second instance of helping Europeans pass the class of civilization when they gave everything to the Greeks and the Etruscans. After the gift of the first civilization, when the Natufians spread civilization and agriculture to Europe, or better yet, when the black Africans, for the third time, came back to Europe as Moors that reintroduced, yet again, all the elements of civilization. Only in such an age would you find people who have built their whole identity around the lie of diminishing those who were not only the source, but came to save them and their ancestors. So much so, that this philosophy has not been inherited by the majority of the earth, some of them in region that we call the Arabia, thinking themselves as white Europeans, which they are not. In my mind, there is a distorted cultural misrepresentation of Maat that causes them to disrespect and mistreat Africans. It is a joke beyond belief. More than a joke, it is a travesty to our collective humanity. And the way out of this is to consciously reject the notions that had been built by selfish 18th and 19th century European archaeologists that we have all inherited, and that is now causing us to have delusions at the planetary scale, preventing true progress. It is beyond irony that in the country where the real McCoy was born, a black inventor without whom the Industrial Revolution wouldn't be what it is today, yes, it is ironic that in this land where people call themselves free, there is an absence of bravery to recognize the true participation of the black man. But instead, the masses are being given the easy path to hatred without evidence, a path where introspection of those who have committed the worst atrocities are blind to the mechanism that begat the outcome, which they now mistake for the cause. Only in such an age would you find people who have built their whole identity around the lie of diminishing those who were not only the source, but came to save them and their ancestors. So much so, that this philosophy has not been inherited by the majority of the earth, some of them in region that we call the Arabia, thinking themselves as white Europeans, which they are not. In my mind, there is a distorted cultural misrepresentation of Maat that causes them to disrespect and mistreat Africans. It is a joke beyond belief. More than a joke, it is a travesty to our collective humanity. And the way out of this is to consciously reject the notions that had been built by selfish 18th and 19th century European archaeologists that we have all inherited and that is now causing us to have delusions at the planetary scale, preventing true progress. It is beyond irony that in the country where the real McCoy was born, a black inventor without whom the Industrial Revolution wouldn't be what it is today, yes, it is ironic that in this land where people call themselves free, there is an absence of bravery to recognize the true participation of the black man. But instead, the masses are being given the easy path to hatred without evidence, a path where introspection of those who have committed the worst atrocities are blind to the mechanism that begat the outcome, which they now mistake for the cause.
Every time there was a black person brought onto the news for expertise, it was someone who's a member of Congress representing a community and they want enterprise zones for the economics. There is someone who is worried about the poverty in the inner city. Never had an audience seen a black person as an expert. Oh, they would have attorneys, but it's talking about a court case about a black person. Would they ever bring a black attorney to talk about a court case about a white person? No. And I said to myself, that is the answer. That's how we turn an entire world of people who think black people are just dumb and stupid, lazy, shiftless, and all they can do is shine my shoes and entertain me and sing and be the athlete on the field. If there was ever a force to change that, it's not people telling them they should think differently. It's me being visible in a way where they have no other choice but to say, oh my gosh, this person knows more about this subject than I do, and he has dark skin. So the next time they see a homeless black person, they're not saying, oh, black people are just like, they have to confront the fact that they just saw a black person tell them that Earth was safe. So it's just quite simple. The next time you're driving your car and somebody comes up with a squeegee to wash your window at the red light and begs for money, and if that person is black, maybe you'll think twice about the causes and effects of poverty.
We are going to be dropping some more knowledge in the next couple of videos, so don't forget to subscribe to both our channels so that Kamjiverse knows that you are not one of those who is without history.